Okay. Hi, Laura. Thank you very much for joining us on the Ideas Lab podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, John. It's great to be here.
Now, you are an editor and a ghostwriter and a number of things, and a writer of your own books. And I think there's lots of interesting questions we could talk about here, lots of things we could talk about. But maybe it's kind of useful to separate out what these different roles are, because when people think about writing a book, particularly when they write it themselves, they don't realize the value in engaging other people. So first of all, why would somebody want to hire an editor?
So the role of an editor is to bring professionalism and credibility to your project. This book is going out in the world as a representation of you, the writer, or you, the business person, and so you want it to be as close to perfect as possible. It's really important that you sort of hit some big markers when you're publishing a book. You want to make sure that the structure of the book is really tight and really focused. There's no holes or pieces out of order. You want to make sure, obviously, that all of the words are correct and all of the facts are correct and it's been proofread, and so it's very polished by the end of the process. And that's very hard to do when you're the one that has written the book, because you're just so close to it, you don't see the problems anymore. And so having an editor, particularly someone who reads widely and has been working in the industry for a long time, they're going to have seen themes arise in different genres of book. And so if you're working with someone, say you're writing a memoir and you're working with an editor that specializes in memoir, they're going to be able to make sure that you're hitting the high notes of that genre, making sure that you have a really clear through line, a thematic progression that readers can follow. They're going to be making sure that you're focused on the right elements of the genre and honing out the information that maybe doesn't belong in this story. And, they're going to help you just see it much more clearly.
Yeah. And so it's worth pulling out from that. It sounds like there are I think of it as two distinct roles within editing. And one is what I think of as low-level stuff of spotting your mistakes, typos, grammar, duplications of, like, wait a minute, you've used that quote already, or you told that story somewhere earlier and I've forgotten because it's well, maybe that's just me, but forgotten by the time you got 2/3 away through the book. But there's another thing, which is that structural edit you mentioned, which is making sure there's a through line. Can you explain a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So a through line is the theme that the book comes back to often, or kind of the big idea that a reader will take away from having read the book. And the structural edit is about making sure that that through line is consistent and present. It's hard reading if there's not a through line, because you're like, where is this going? Like, what is the point of all of this? You need a kind of a theme to tie all of the material together. And so the editor's role in that process is to look for where things are out of place. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, there will always be areas where the author has skipped ahead, right? You think you've written the complete thought or think you've explained enough because you know what you're talking about. But to a reader who has no context of your life or your story, this, paragraph or page or chapter even can just make completely no sense. So the role of the editor there is to say, well, hang on, we need to flesh this out and explain what this is and why it's here. And, maybe actually this fits better in this part of the book, or, maybe that story that you tell towards the end would be better at the beginning because it would set a better tone and help people understand a bit more. They're sort of looking at it as like, each element of the book, each word, line, paragraph, chapter is a component that can be moved around. If you think of it like building blocks, you can kind of shuffle them around and make as many different configurations as you want. And the role of the editor there in that structural edit is to make sure they're in the configuration that ends with the most beautiful possible outcome.
Yeah, I think it's really important, because I see a classic thing people do when they start writing is they kind of go backwards and forwards in the story. And the most powerful thing to do is to go from, like the hero's journey of challenging situation through the call to adventure, through, a big obstacle, and then out the other side and things are better and you're transformed as a person. But what they do, and this can happen even in, the space of a paragraph sometimes, if it's just a little bit within a chapter, But what people do is they tell this bit at the beginning and how it's difficult, and then we say, and then it was great, and then I got over it. But it was really bad when I was, and they're going backwards and forwards, and it loses all the power of it. Whereas if you just rearrange it, suddenly it does that magic thing that our brain likes so much, which is it's my agent calls it a narrative arc, which is similar to kind of through line.
Yes.
We're going on a journey with people, and the journey doesn't go backwards and forwards, unless it's, of course, it's a clever literary device where you're going through a narrative arc, but you're telling a story by jumping back in time, and you have to be pretty clever at it to do that.
That is a tricky device to pull off, I have to say.
Yeah. Not everyone can write Memento. Maybe some people don't get that reference. Right. It's an amazing film about memory, and it's you don't know what happens before what else, because the guy doesn't have a memory. And so, I read some self-published business books, and I just think there's a really good book struggling to get out here, but I cannot stand reading it any longer, because there's another thing people do is that there's repetition. So you might want to deliberately repeat something, but do it with consciousness and say, look, I want to make this point again because it's so important that even when you're doing your marketing, you have to be yourself. For instance, one of the concepts I would impress on people, just the same as when you're choosing your business idea. So you're coming back to the same themes, but you don't want to just make the same point, really powerfully once and then half make it another time because you forgot you've already kind of said that. And I think that seems like a mistake, but are there any other classic mistakes that you see people doing in business books in particular?
I think some of the big ones are assuming that your reader has the same worldview or same understanding of this topic that you do, and they just don't. The role, as I see it, for the editor or the ghostwriter in that situation is to be an advocate for the reader and to say, hang on, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. You're assuming that people understand what you're talking about. So obviously an entrepreneur has a huge wealth of experience and expertise, but to translate that to a general readership takes a bit of interpretation. And so you've really got to help them break it down to kind of a base level, explain the foundational stuff and build on it so that the reader has a growing sense of competence in what they're learning. Another thing is information hierarchy. So telling things out of order or jumping into concepts or ideas when they haven't sort of set the stage to talk about those ideas. You've got to really make sure you bring people with you and don't get ahead of them. People will not persevere in a book where they're confused about why this thing is happening, or, having to flick back a few pages because, did they talk about this already? Did I misunderstand? There's got to be a lot of clarity, and people will give up on a book that has these kind of holes and switchbacks and
I read a book that introduced some sort of concept, or thought it had introduced a concept, and the whole thing revolved around this concept. And at no point did I understand what the concept was actually saying.
Right.
And then they just kept referencing it forevermore. And I just went like, what is this thing? And yeah. And so this is why so many self-written, self-published books are so terrible. So sorry to be harsh, but it's true. But there's nothing wrong with self-publishing in itself. It just means that you do need somebody who's going to, sometimes people use two different, like for me with a book deal with Pearson, there's sometimes a different person doing the line edit, I think it's sometimes called, or the proofreading. And then another person will do the structural edit. And sometimes it's the commissioning editor that does the kind of structural edit and says, well, surely this chapter should be before this. I remember when I handed in my first book 10 years ago, Screw Work, Let's Play, and the commissioning editor went through it and read the whole thing and sent all his comments. And in my voice, it was just like, why on earth is this chapter even here? And it was just this sort of, it took me 24 hours before I could actually bear to reply to her and pick myself up off the floor. And possibly she should learn to give her feedback a little bit more gently for first time authors. But now I know that that's what a lot of commissioning editors in publishers do, because they're just a bit blunt and haven't got the time. But she really made a massive difference by giving me that feedback. She said, look, you've got to have a structure to every chapter, open with a quote, then a story, and then you end with action points, and then in between you've got all this other stuff, and then you've got there's different styles in the book, where there's a case study style, there's a breakout box that gives you more information or something, and they each have a different format as well. But you at least have to have the concept before you even go to a designer that there are different elements to your book. So that's one of the things that I guess you're doing for people.
Yeah, helping them understand the best way to present the information is also a big part of, it doesn't seem like part of what you would do as a writer, but actually there's so much that goes into understanding what you're reading, right? And so it's the difference between reading a page that is just a wall of text and a page that has lots of white space on it. It's much easier to understand the page with all of that white space and variations in the paragraph length and sentence length it's so much easier to understand than trying to wade through this big chunk. And, pictures help, obviously, and breakout boxes. There's footnotes. There's so many different elements that you can include to communicate more than just what is actually written. And so I think a lot of people understand how they can communicate with their reader. It's as I say, it's much more than just the words on the page. And so I do think there is a lot of work to be done before you engage a designer, or before you go to formatting for publication. You've got to have a really clear idea. If you're self-publishing, you have to have a very clear idea of what you want the book to look like physically before you go to a designer, because if you say, here's my book, make it pretty, they'll do what they are going to do with it, and that will be a result, but it won't be the result that you want. So it's not enough to just say, do your thing. You've got to have a very clear vision for how you want the reader to experience it, the parts that you want to highlight and emphasize. How can you engage all of the senses of the reader beyond just, scanning the words on the page.
Now, another thing you probably come across, in fact, I think you've worked with some quite famous people on things that are more autobiographical. Is that right?
Something.
Yeah. And so if we look at memoirs, which a lot of people want to write either a straight memoir of their life, or they want to write something that is at least semi-autobiographical. So you might even write a business book, which is autobiographical. It has your journey in there, and maybe your hard life or something, or life experiences that formed you, that you then overcame in order to become successful. So that's a very common kind of motivator for people to write a book. But those can often go wrong, aren't they? Can't they? So is there something in particular people should watch out for if they're setting out to write something as a memoir or as an autobiographical nonfiction book? What should they bear in mind?
I think the most important thing is to choose a specific element of your life to focus on. So whether that's a time period or a lesson you're having to learn over and over again, or tracking something across multiple generations, focus on something rather than everything. Because when you focus on everything, it becomes very messy and it's difficult for the reader to follow, again, because life doesn't have a through line. It doesn't have a narrative arc. We make meaning as we go. And so when you're writing, you also have to make meaning for the reader, for them to be able to follow along with you. And so the best memoirs, I think, have, they're focused on a very short period of time or something thematic. And so, for example, Open by Andre Agassi is an amazing memoir written with a ghostwriter whose memoir is also amazing. But Open is focused on Agassi's struggle in the spotlight and the battle he was constantly having with himself between his private and public personas. And that's a very specific problem to grapple with. And it gives shape to everything else. Everything that he recounts about his life goes through this lens, and it makes it very compelling because you understand these experiences he's talking about as a child feed this paradox that he's experiencing. And so it helps a lot to just pick a theme or a specific period in time.
Yeah, that's That is really interesting. And I suppose I was thinking of Elton John's autobiography, or that it was written by a ghostwriter. And it's really fantastically written. It's very entertaining, even if you're not an Elton John fan, which I'm not particularly. But he knows everybody who's ever existed in music, which makes it quite entertaining. And every celebrity you can name. But there are themes in there about his drug addictions, and B, his difficult childhood. It's kind of and the way that presents itself as his terrible behavior. So he's very open throughout, completely open, or at least, from what we're reading, it seems it might maybe done something which is even more terrible, which we don't know about. But he's very open about how unreasonable he's often been with partners or people around him and stuff like that. And it makes it very endearing. And I think that's a really good thing. So you would have thought that being one of the best tennis players in the world would be a pretty good theme to start with. But like you say, there's something else. And I think also the fact that that also gives a struggle, doesn't it? It also gives a kind of a human flavor, which other people might relate to. So lots of people can relate to having had a difficult family situation and having some addiction of some kind. So we can even relate in some ways to Elton John.
Absolutely. And there's so much shared experience, across life, no matter who you are or where you grow up or where you're from, everybody has consistent experiences to some extent. There's search for meaning, there's search for identity, there's your family relationship, your position in your community. There's so many things that we all go through in different ways. And even if you are not famous and you think, well, maybe my story isn't interesting enough to tell, there are these universal themes which can make you very compelling to somebody who has no connection to you whatsoever. And so I think the other thing I would say with memoir is don't discount the interest of your own story. I think a lot of people talk themselves out of writing something when actually they probably have very interesting things to say, just because they don't think they're famous enough or successful enough or rich enough or whatever. And those are not good reasons to not write your story.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. So it's not just about how dramatic your life is or how big a success you've had or whatever it might be, but it's about the themes that you can pull out that everybody can relate to. That's really interesting. And so if people come to you and hire you so you do editing, but you also do ghostwriting, how does that work? If I want to hire a ghostwriter, does that mean I just go, I'd like a book on this subject, and you just go write it? Presumably it requires a bit more work on my part, doesn't it?
A little bit more work than that.
And isn't ghostwriting cheating? I'm sure a lot of people think that, right? It's like, it's written by a ghostwriter.
So I would say ghostwriting is actually very efficient. For a lot of people who have very interesting stories, trying to write it themselves is going to get in the way of the story. Like you said, you've read many business books where there's a great book in there, but it hasn't been able to work its way out. And often that's because the person writing it is not a professional writer. They're maybe a professional marketer or a professional tennis player or musician or whatever. They're great at their thing, but they haven't done, the decades of work and study and slog to become a great writer. Like I haven't done the work to become a great tennis player. I couldn't walk onto the court and do what Agassi does. He, in the same way, knew that he couldn't sit down at a keyboard and do what a great writer would do. And so he hired a writer whose work he really liked. And so I think it's unfair for a lot of, particularly entrepreneurs and people who are running their own businesses and wanting to write a book. It's unfair to expect yourself to be able to sit down and produce something that you feel really proud of and happy with, and that's at the standard that you dream it to be. So I think, in the same way that you hire somebody to do your taxes, you might as well hire somebody to do your writing. And so the caveat there is that you have to spend a lot of time with your ghostwriter. So it's not a question of, okay, you just go off and read on my blog posts and stitch them together. That's not how it works. It's very much a case of setting a strategic intent for the book. What do you want this to be? What do you want the reader to take away from this? What do you want their transformation to be after having read this book? And then working backwards and saying, okay, well, what do we need to talk about for all of those things to happen? And once you've sort of been able to build a quite detailed outline, then you go into interviewing, and that interview process is very immersive. I'm going to ask you all the questions I can think of, and there will be no holds barred. So it's, it becomes very very close working relationship. And then once I've got all of that information and I've spent, months talking to you and sort of immersed in your brain, then I can go away and take all those recordings, turn it into a draft, and then we can, make sure that it's all very much you, that there's nothing missing, that everything is in the order that it's supposed to be. I'm going to want a few of your friends to read it, a few of your business contacts to read it, people who have known you a long time, to make sure that there's no points where it doesn't sound like the client. So it's very immersive. It's very focused on making it sound as much like the person I'm working with as possible. And then obviously you go into editing and publication and all of that stuff at the end.
Yeah. And for that reason, it's not a cheap thing to hire a ghostwriter, because you're really in it for weeks, if not months. So
yes, spend about 6 months at a time on each project.
Oh, wow. Really? Yeah. So yeah, this is, it is a significant investment. However, if you have, in the case of a business book, if you have a business that's working, to take out the time to write a book, it's just phenomenally expensive, I have found. And
Sorry.
It kind of worked out well. But this third book that's I have coming out this month, which is called Fuck Work, Let's Play, is basically a new version of my first book. It's rewritten and got new stories and new advice in it, and a new title. And that meant I could do that relatively quickly, because writing an entire book from scratch just takes, probably about the same amount of time it takes you, basically, which is 6 months. It may not be full time 6 months. You might be splicing it with other things, but it's a huge amount of time. And if you took out 6 months, and spend it just on, if you had an extra 6 months to spend on your business to make more money, you'd make a huge, once you've got a working business, you make a huge sum of money. So, I think, when people see the price tag of, they might be a bit alarmed, but I think you got to think of it in those terms. And I think if you want to write a book and it's just your story, maybe you have I don't know, if you just want to do it for your own kind of, like, you want to tell your life story, maybe you don't do it that way. And maybe you write it first and then you perhaps just hire someone like you to edit it and to shape it, which will be cheaper.
Definitely. It really depends on what your intent for the book is. If you are doing it as a personal project for catharsis of some sort, or just to prove to yourself that you can do it, or for your own social group, then do it yourself. It will be really such a valuable experience, and you'll get a huge amount of satisfaction from having done it. But if your goal is to use the book to grow your business, or to grow your authority, or to get speaking engagements, or insert business goal here, then it's usually going to be much more effective to have somebody write it for you. Because as you say, you're busy running your business. There are probably better uses, more profitable uses of your time. You're unlikely to recoup the cost of your book project from the upfront book sales. You're more likely to recoup the cost from selling your high ticket offers after somebody has come into your sphere from reading the book. So if you sell, a very high end product, you might only need to sell one to a reader to recoup your cost. But it's much more effective for you to focus on making that as seamless and effective as possible, and let somebody else handle that sort of front end acquisition.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. And you've written a couple of books yourself. Your older one is about content marketing. It looks quite interesting, but there is actually a way for people to get your new book, How to Write This Book. There's a way to get that for free, which we'll talk about in a moment. What's How to Write This Book about?
So that one is about writing, publishing, and marketing a business book. So that's basically the entire process that I use with my ghostwriting clients to get their book from idea to listed and available for sale, and then what to do to make sure it actually does sell once it's published, because it's very easy to go through the process of writing and publication and everything and think, whew, I'm done. But actually, you're only halfway there, because you've actually got to sell the thing to make it do what you want. So the marketing is a really important piece, and it starts a lot earlier in the process than people realize. So yeah, I think that's definitely an important thing to focus on.
Yeah, it is, and that's one I'm always telling people. And they imagine that, particularly if they're going to get a book deal, they imagine that once they've got a book deal, that's the end of story. But it seems like Pearson are going to put a lot of weight behind my new book and put quite a lot of effort and money into promoting it. But you can't guarantee that, and often, even when they do that, you can have just as much effect yourself with your own marketing tasks. So I think that's a really important thing. So I mentioned that you can get this book, How to Write This Book, for free. Where do they go to do that?
So if people head to my website, lauraiswriting.com, it will pop up there on the homepage. Just scroll down a little and the pop-up will emerge, and just put your details in and a PDF will come straight to you.
Brilliant. So lauraiswriting.com. Yeah, and I've done that already, so I'm going to have a look at that.
Thank you.
And there's always more I can learn. Well, thank you, Laura. I think that's been really interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.